Hi everyone, James here. Welcome to another video. So today I'm going to be looking at some books for a change rather than CDs, records, etc. So I've been reading a big load of music books over the last few months. I'm going to catch you up with some of the titles that I've been enjoying. These do go back a fair few months actually. I'm going to grab them in a fairly random order, but I'll start with one which I think comes from the longest period ago. I picked this up from a charity shop a while ago, last year it was. This is Sting and Broken Music. So I didn't have huge expectations for this book, but really enjoyed it. Really, really great. In fact, I would go as far as to say it's probably, well, it's one of the most enjoyable music autobiographies I've ever read. Generally speaking, I'm more of a fan of biographies than autobiographies. I tend to find autobiographies can be a bit self-indulgent. Sting obviously is quite a self-indulgent man, isn't he? But what makes this book really good is that it purely really only focuses on his wilderness years, on his childhood, adolescence, and his early years playing on the circuit in Newcastle. And I wasn't sure about that at first. I was thinking surely it would be interesting to know all about the the ins and outs of his years as a star with the Police. I mean, it does touch on that a little bit, but it's mainly the story of his musical apprenticeship, I guess, and what an apprenticeship it was. I mean, truly amazing. It's kind of well known that the Police, I guess they kind of hitched themselves onto the new wave punk thing, but they were from the previous generation really. They were progressive rock musicians, and Sting's musical background is incredibly interesting. He'd really earned his stripes. He played on cruise ships, he'd done the working men club circuit, he'd done the pubs. I mean, he really did serve his dues. Absolutely fascinating. And when it gets into the story of how he hooked up with the other guys in the Police and Mars Copeland, and that's towards the end of the book, it does become very interesting. But it doesn't suffer anything from not going into the fame years. It's truly a really interesting book because it does focus on the pre-fame era. So I tend to find these books where it's the early part of the artist's life which is really interesting. Once it gets into the big fame and success years, most of the time you're just on that kind of treadmill then of tour album, so it's not all that interesting, and drug problems and pressures of fame, etc. But I think he did a good job in that book really of deciding to draw the line before all that started. Anyway, if you've got any doubts, I would encourage you to, if you see this book and it's cheap, pick it up. It's genuinely really enjoyable, and it gives you a real insight into the kind of crap a musician has to go through before making it big. I mean, I went through all that crap and then didn't make it big, so I didn't do the right thing there. But anyway, really enjoyable. Right, so let's just go with these in a fairly random order now. I'm nearly at the end of this one. I haven't quite finished. I picked this up just before Christmas, and this is some read. Wild Thing: The Short Spellbinding Life of Jimi Hendrix by Philip Norman. Now, Philip Norman, he's well known for doing the book on the Beatles, isn't he? Was it Shout? And he's done books on a variety of different artists over the years. I think he's done Elton John, John Lennon. This is really interesting. I didn't know much about Jimi Hendrix's life really, but I've been listening to a fair bit of his stuff again recently, so I thought it'd be good to buy a book, and what a great cover that is. The most eye-opening thing about this book, just apart from how many sexual partners Jimi had, is the closing section where he goes into the ins and outs of Jimi's death and all the different eyewitness accounts, all of which contradicted each other. Absolutely fascinating, quite disturbing as well. And it goes into the fairly dark postscripts of the Jimi Hendrix estate, after his death, and what happened with all the litigation and the way his music was archived and released posthumously, all that kind of stuff. But the stuff about his death and the circumstances of his death, and how he was basically on the watch list of American intelligence because he was kind of seen as being affiliated to the Black Liberation guys, the Black Panthers and stuff, and he was really high up on their list of people to watch. And there was a bit of a conspiracy theory that he'd been bumped off, but there's no particular proof of that. But anyway, apart from that, really, really fascinating. I'm nearly at the end of it. I'm just on the last little bit now, but that is a great book. Really well written, and really interesting about his early career as well. Him coming up on the streets of Seattle and trying to make a living and trying to rub two coins together, and the very troubled relationship he had with his father as well. He was not willing or able to show him any fatherly love, really. And his younger brother, who, you know, spent most of his life in and out of the state penitentiary. Fascinating stuff, but yeah, very good. Wild Thing, the short spellbinding life of Jimi Hendrix by Philip Norman. That was a cracking read. This one, this is going back to last year. Quite a long book this, but absolutely brilliant. You can see how dog-eared this is. I just totally devoured this. This is Shock and Awe, Glam Rock and Its Legacy by Simon Reynolds. Now, Simon Reynolds is a hugely respected and brilliant music journalist and writer. He wrote a couple of great books. He did the book on post-punk, Rip It Up and Start Again. He did a book on rave culture, which is also fantastic. This, I think, is his masterpiece. It really goes into the ins and outs of the glam rock period. You can see on the front there, it goes through all the history. T-Rex, Bowie, Roxy Music, Sparks, the New York Dolls. Brilliant chapter on Queen, genuinely. I mean, in 10 pages, he says everything that needs to be said about Queen. It's incredibly insightful. Some of the stuff he writes about the Queen 2 album, in particular the song The Fairy Feller's Masterstroke, and how it was based on this incredible weird painting. Truly amazing, some of the insights he comes out with. I mean, it's a big book, but it will really give you an insight into the period. Brilliant writing as well. He's such a vivid and compelling author. So I would definitely advise you to get that one if you have any interest in that period at all. T-Rex, Alex Cooper, Sparks, The Sweet. It's just really comprehensive and brilliant. So there we go. Shock and Awe, Glam Rock and Its Legacy by Simon Reynolds. And my copy looks fit for the bin. This, again, was a brilliant book. This was a bit of an impulse purchase. Got it from Waterstones before Christmas. This is Coltrane, The Story of a Sound by Ben Ratliff. And I bought this really because even though I love a lot of Coltrane's music, I don't know much about him. I don't know much about his life. Or I didn't anyway. Now this book, it's split into two halves. The first half deals in Coltrane's music and how he put it together and all his different collaborators. The second half of the book deals with his legacy. So about halfway through you get to Coltrane's death, and the second half of the book talks about all the different musicians who came up in his slipstream. So it gets into the free jazz movement. It talks about people like Albert Ayler, Archie Shepp, you know, all those guys. Very, very interesting, very, very fascinating book. Delves deep into the critical reception that Coltrane had during his life and the way he was misunderstood, and maybe the way that he was over-championed by some people as well. You know, people who perhaps read too much into his music, and then there were the people who rejected his music as he moved, you know, further into the abstract outer realms of the avant-garde. But a really fascinating insight into the way he supported and nurtured young musicians, even those musicians who didn't really have his musical pedigree. You know, he would basically allow anybody to come up on stage and play with him. And you know, during the free jazz movement, you had a lot of guys who didn't really have much grounding in musical theory, as Coltrane had had. Obviously, you know, he'd studied all the chord changes that were in existence. You know, he'd come up through the bebop era. A lot of the free jazz guys later didn't have that grounding, but Coltrane, he didn't seem to care about that. I think to him it was more to do with participating and getting up and having a go. Really amazing, you know, free-spirited musician. And this book gives a very honest appraisal of his music. It doesn't totally deify him, and in fact Ratliff goes to some trouble actually to perhaps, you know, pop a few bubbles along the way and to you know, maybe be a bit more realistic in what Coltrane's achievement actually was. But cracking read, Faber and Faber. I got that from Waterstones before Christmas, but hugely enjoyable, and I will no doubt read that again because there was an awful lot to take in. Okay, I'll just do two more because time is running short. This book helped me when I wrote my Squeeze book last year. It came out a few months before I thought I'd finish work on the Squeeze book, and then I had to go back and put quite a lot of stuff in because it was so interesting. This is 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back, My Life in the Music Business, Miles Copeland III. So this is the guy who managed Squeeze and the Police, His father founded the CIA in America. Really interesting life. You know, he spent his early years in the Middle East, came over to England in the 60s really, and started doing rock promotion. He was instrumental in the formation of the band Wishbone Ash, but then in the mid 1970s he kind of got involved with the punk scene, started to release records on a variety of independent labels, and did some fairly eye-opening things. It's one of those kind of classic eye-watering memoirs really, but it's really interesting. It goes through all the 80s years, you know, the IRS years, and you know the work he did with a huge number of bands, you know, REM and I think the Go-Go's, Bangles, just kind of, you know, all sorts. But the early years on the circuit in London, when he's trying to get the Police together, and the rivalry between Squeeze and the Police, an enjoyable read. And yeah, I would definitely recommend that one. Miles Copeland, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. My life in the music business. Okay, and now this one was a Christmas gift, and I actually managed to read it in about, I don't know, 6 weeks, and it's quite a big book, but I kind of persevered because I knew if I didn't I would just spend months and months reading it, and I wanted to read it in a finite amount of time. But this is Tencc, The Worst Band in the World by Liam Newton, and this really covers their entire career really. It delves back into the pre-fame years and follows the guys through all the various bands they were in. You had the Mindbenders with Eric Stewart, and the Mockingbirds, I think, was it, with Graham Gouldman, and all the different, you know, configurations. Goes through the founding of the Strawberry Studio, the period when they worked with Neil Sedaka. Goes into the Tencc years. Catalogues the split in the band when these two guys split from these two guys. Godley and Cream split from Gouldman and Stewart. There was a big schism. Lord Cream and Kevin Godley went off and did their own thing, the Gizmo, that weird guitar creation which they came up with. All the mad work that they did, you know, the videos and the concept albums. And meanwhile, Eric and Graham took Tencc off in a more kind of soft rock direction, and lots of reformations later on, and a fair bit of hardship, I guess, later on as they tried to continue with the Tencc name, and you know, arguably took it well past its sell-by date, I guess. But lots of stuff I didn't know. It is a big book, and occasionally it did feel maybe a little bit like it could have done with an edit. But certainly, if you're interested in the history of Tencc and you want to get all, you know, into the ins and outs of it, that book, I can't imagine any other book, you know, doing it more thoroughly. So there we go, Tencc, The Worst Band in the World, and that's by Liam Newton. We'll finish with just a bit of fun. This one, this is Queen, album by album, and it's by Martin Popoff, who's a Canadian writer. I was clued into him through watching the channel Sea of Tranquility, which is Pete Pardo. He does a lot of discussion videos with Martin Popoff, which I watch from time to time. Martin showed this in one of the videos. I thought it looked quite good fun. It takes the albums one at a time, lots of pictures, lots of fun. And it's mainly not Martin Popoff on his own, it's mainly him in conversation with a variety of different people. You've got Dee Schneider from Twisted Sister, and a variety of other people. I must say, in terms of his collaborators in the book, the emphasis is rather too much on sort of heavy metal and heavy rock. It would have been nice if maybe he'd found some other people who were maybe not from that particular musical world in order to give, you know, a different kind of perspective. So it's mainly the perspective of you know, a bunch of heavy rockers on Queen's music, but it's still interesting. There's some good insights. It takes the albums one at a time, talks about the you know, how they were made and the stories behind the recording, and it does a fairly good job of telling the Queen story from start to finish. So that was a stocking filler to myself at Christmas, but highly enjoyable. Queen, album by album, by Martin Popoff. And we'll finish with this book, which I haven't read yet, but this is Mott the Hoople and Ian Hunter in the 1970s by John van der Kiest. This is part of the series Decades, which is published by Sonic Bond. Now I'm hoping that I'm going to be interviewing John van der Kiest in an interview quite soon, because I'm in touch with him. So I won't say too much about this book at the moment, because hopefully that video will be coming up. But I fancy reading a book about Mott the Hoople. I do happen to know John. It's a long story, so I picked this up. So I've asked John if he'll appear on the channel, and he said yes. He's never used Zoom before, so we're going to have to get him through that little experience, but hopefully that'll be coming along soon. So yeah, Decades, Mott the Hoople and Ian Hunter in the 1970s. Haven't finished it yet, I've started it, but stay tuned to the channel. Hopefully we'll be in conversation with John very soon. And, leave some comments below if you read any of these books or if you intend to read any of them. It'd be great to hear from you. So hope you enjoyed the selection. Take care. See you soon.